Welcome to Picture Me Coding, a music podcast about software. We are your hosts, Erik and Mike Mull, and every week we take you into the stomach of the whale of software engineering using this little boat that's made out of music. How you feeling this week, Mike?
I'm feeling my age, I guess.
So you're feeling good. You feel pretty good.
If you insist, sure.
I think for our listeners, we have to admit that Mike is a guy who runs probably 50 miles a week, backpacks every few weeks. Very fit, right? You probably won't cop to that though, huh?
Uh, Relatively fit for a senior citizen like myself, yes.
Yeah. Relatively fit for an ultra marathon style senior citizen. So just picture that in your head. Uh, I wanted to tell you about the Baroness EP I've been listening to called Beneath the Rose. I don't remember, I don't think you really like Baroness. Baroness is one of these bands that I feel like I'm telling my friends about, and they're just like, yeah, I don't get it. It's okay if you want to like that. This one's cheating a little bit, this EP, because it's just a couple songs, but I just love this band. Um, the new EP, it's a bit of a departure from earlier stuff. It's still pretty recognizable as Baroness, but it sounds like the first song almost sounds like a Jesus Lizard mixed with Baroness song. It's this kind of like bombastic metal music, unabashed, unashamed. They're one of those bands that are so out there and unabashed doing what they're doing that you almost feel embarrassed for them. It's like a kind of embarrassment you feel for stadium rock, in the 80s.
Sure.
The thing with Baroness, though, is it's almost like I imagine that they're playing inside a cathedral, and instead of like loud metal rock and roll, they're playing D&D or something like that. That's how I imagine them.
Yeah, I'm surprised. I'm surprised I don't like the band more than I do. I mean, I don't dislike them, but given my relatively omnivorous taste for metal and other hard music, I'm kind of surprised that I don't really love them.
I have this conversation a lot with people. Like, oh, I like this band Baroness. And they're like, yeah, just I'm not feeling it. But you know what? Here's the last thing I'll say. It's just an EP, two songs. It's fun. It's right what you would expect for a Baroness. I really like it. If you queue up a Baroness album in Spotify and then it completes and Spotify decides to play you The Sword afterwards, I think you're doing something right with your music. That's a good band right there.
Yeah, that is a good sign.
What have you been listening to? That was a short one from me.
So I'd like to preface this a little bit by saying that a large part of my uh, music listening is classical music. My mom was a pianist and a church organist for many years, and so I kind of grew up with Bach and Beethoven and such things. Um, so this choice may sound a little out there, but it's not. It's not an outlier for my particular taste. Anyway, the record that I've been listening to a lot this week is it's an album called Resilience by a Russian pianist named Yuliana Avdieva, and it's a collection of piano works by some Polish and Russian composers, two of which you've probably heard of, Shostakovich and Prokofiev,
Hmm.
and then a couple who some people may not have heard of. One is a composer named Spielman. He's Polish, and I think he is somewhat well known primarily because he was kind of the subject of this movie that was made about 20 years ago called The Pianist, uh, about a classic pianist who survives the Holocaust. Uh,
I remember that movie. I like that movie. I have some dumb questions though. Prokofiev, is that the Peter and the Wolf guy? This is my elementary school
um,
classical music.
among other things, yeah. Um, he's I'm not sure what he's best known for. I guess my favorite favorite Prokofiev pieces are probably the what's called the Lieutenant Kijay Suite. It's a film from a movie,
Mm. What do you
Um,
like about this album? What's the name of the album again?
it's called Resilience. Um,
What do you like about it? I'm so naive to classical music. I hear stuff and I think that sounds like classical music. Yep. I like listening to it. I couldn't tell you. It's almost kind of the same color to me.
I like the fact that it's well recorded and well played. I think, I'm not sophisticated enough musically to comment on the specifics of Avdieva's playing, but to me it sounds very well played and very well recorded. I think these pieces are interesting. I think the name comes primarily because of the pieces by the Polish composers.
Hmm.
But I also think it's sort of maybe meta commentary on. I've read that Avdieva is kind of outspoken against the war in Ukraine, so
Mm. Mm.
there may be some reasons there as well. But anyway, I like this music, um, especially the stuff that I've heard. The sort of highlighted piece I think here is the pieces by Spielman, but which I did not know. But
Mm.
there's also a fairly well known concerto by Prokofiev on this album, which is um, it's an interesting piece. It's a piece that you hear a lot in concert venues, so it's kind of a common part of the standard things that get played by soloists with big orchestras. But um, the there's also a piece in here by a composer named Weinberg that I had never heard, which is just really really beautiful. Um, this is modern music, so it doesn't fall into the sort of baroque and romantic era music that I typically listen to.
Mm.
So it's
The only
also
thing, when you say modern classical, the only thing I have is, oh yeah, Wittgenstein hated that stuff. People are like, what is wrong with you? It's 1930 something. Get it with it. That's all I know. I couldn't name any. I couldn't tell you. Rachmaninoff, I think maybe modern.
yeah modernish.
Here,
Yeah,
here, here. My, I have two questions for you. Do you work when you do this, when you listen to this music, or do you find that you have to like focus on the music? It's intricate, it's complex. You got to listen to it, or can you sort of do other things?
I think both. If you can put this music on in the background, and it will, it gets you in the right mindset. I think to do intellectual work, but it's also the sort of thing where you can put your headphones on and listen to it intently and
Hmm.
get more out of it. Um, these are some challenging pieces. They're not always super melodic, and some of it is unfamiliar even to people who are relatively well versed in classical music. So
Hmm.
it's not Chopin, it's not Beethoven. It's a little more challenging than that. And
It's not something the guy in the mall is going to play.
well, it would be an interesting mall if they did play it.
Sounds like a
But
mall we want to go to. So here's my second question. Does it make babies smarter? No, actually, that's not my question. My question is, you're the guy who told me about the latest Godflesh album. Do you have a
yes,
playlist? Secretly hoping you have a playlist, which is like Godflesh, and then this album, and then the Tubs. Do you have this all on one playlist?
I confess that I don't. Although
I'm disappointed.
I do wonder sometimes if Spotify thinks that I'm like sharing my account with some other person because I changed genres. It probably gives their algorithms a bit of whiplash.
Hmm. I think one of the fundamental things for me is I want to not believe in genre, but maybe we should leave that as a, a bigger topic. I wanna imagine we're fans. Genre is a pedestrian, earthly thing. It has nothing to do with us up here in the sky, listening to these sounds.
Yeah, I think my personal music taste, I always used to joke that my taste is like 7.2 on Pitchfork. It's not particularly sophisticated, but I also do sort of seek out different things and a little bit of novelty. And uh, I listen to a wide variety of things during a typical day.
I guess
Just
I mean, talk about genre. I'm not sure if genre really helps us that much. Sure, classical. Yeah, I guess you can say there is a boundary of things that we could call classical. In college, I had a class with the poet from England, Tom Gunn, very interesting person. And I asked him once about the supposed group or genre he was part of. They called this group the Movement. He said, "Oh, that was some critics thing. I didn't know any of those people." And I think that's kind of how I think about genre. It's like critics want to be able to write about your work and compare it to others, and they want to put it in a bin at the record store. That's how genre benefits. It doesn't benefit us, the fans. So Godflesh and modern classical music, you put it all in the same bucket. It all goes to the same stomach, right? I tell my kid that you can mix that food.
yeah, I mean, for me, if it gives me some sort of pleasure or intellectual stimulation, I don't really filter much beyond that.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think I get intellectual stimulation from Baroness, but you know what? Pleasure. Keep going, Baroness. I have a question for you this week. We have been interviewing candidates at work, and I wanted to know how bad it can get. What's the worst interview question you've ever gotten?
This is a tough one. Um, I think there's two things, and they're very different. One is, we've talked about this before, but once in an interview, somebody asked me if I were to get a body part pierced, which body part and why, which is a pretty bad, inappropriate interview question, but
It's
also
pretty bad, yeah.
it was pretty amusing at the time, and I really
Did
didn't
you
mind it.
answer it when they asked you that, or did you just be like, "Don't want the job, bye"?
I think I did answer it, but I think I answered it in such a way that it sort of classified me as uh, a bit boring because I probably said earlobe or something like that.
So we're in an interview. Here's my question for you: if you were going to pierce one of your body parts, which part would you pierce? Which body part would you pierce? That seems like one of those questions that speaks a lot more about the interviewer than the interviewee. It's like if you show up and I say, "What's your favorite piece of Dungeons and Dragons lore?" And admittedly, I know nothing about Dungeons and Dragons lore except for reading a Stranger Things Wikipedia. If somebody asks you that, they obviously care a lot about that thing, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the interview. That's a great question.
I think it was probably sort of a cultural touchstone. They kind of wanted to see if I was offended or alarmed by that, and so I think I passed that test in that sense. But
When I was listening to Godflesh, I was thinking about this. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead. What's the other? You have another one though. That's bad. It's not that kind of bad. Different kind of bad.
yeah, I got a question one time about the interviewer was asking me how I would go about implementing a spell checker,
Hmm.
and I was struggling to answer it, and I realized a few minutes into the discussion that the interviewer had no idea how people implement spell checkers.
Why did he ask? he
I
wanted. He was. Is this a thing he had to do at work, and he figured you could solve it for him?
I don't know, maybe it was a homework problem or something, but it's difficult to answer a question when you are trying to figure out in what wrong way the questioner is imagining that you might do this thing. So anyway, um,
I think it's worth taking a little detour into what we call whiteboarding. We have a verb in our industry, to whiteboard. We talk about this a lot for software engineering interviews, where candidates, companies want to make sure that when they're interviewing candidates for software roles that they can write code. And so there's a lot of different ways they try to establish this. And one of the ways traditionally has been, can you go up to the whiteboard and write some code that solves a particular problem? I've had interviews like this. Um, and I think so. My worst interview experience ever wasn't directly, it was like a sort of follow on to whiteboarding. So first I got asked, this is many, many years ago, probably 8 years ago. Um, I got asked to do a whiteboarding session. I think the question I was asked was, oh, write some code. It opens a file and there's numbers on it in different lines on the file. And you want to sum up all those numbers and give me a total. It's like a pretty trivial, like, can you write a code to open a file? Can you write code that loops through some things and does some data processing or whatever? So I wrote like the typical, this is mostly going to be Python at the job. So I wrote the typical Python thing. I remember the time the guy responds, first of all, with, you didn't use a class. In Python, we can write in classes and functions. He said, you didn't use a class, but I guess I won't knock you down for that.
Mm.
That's pretty funny because this is a pretty easy thing to solve with just a basic function. Um, and then I had, like typical error handling. I'm casting these things to integers or floats or whatever, and I'm chomping white space and I'm, catching exceptions. And he starts like cutting all of that out with the pen, like, you don't need any of this. And he ultimately was like, you can open the file. File's got numbers on every line, and you can just add those together without processing it at all. And in my head, I was like, this guy doesn't know Python at all. It was a little disturbing. So that even wasn't the worst part. So then the next day I had to go back for follow up with the CTO at that place. It's a very small company. They only had 3 or 4 developers. They were trying to grow. And that interview with the CTO turned into an hour where he was browbeating me about different things. He was saying, the first thing he said was, because I had done Haskell and some open source Haskell, and he says, you're wasting your time with Haskell and functional programming. It's a dead end. All problems have already been solved by object oriented programming and Gang of Four design patterns. I was like, all problems? I had a real hard problem with this.
I can imagine. Yeah.
That's a weird thing to say, a weird thing to hear in an interview. And I thought maybe he means like Turing completeness. Like, that's weird, right? Like, but Super Mario Brothers is Turing complete. Can you imagine if like somebody said to you, all problems have been solved by hacking Super Mario Brothers levels?
Yeah. Well, I've heard similar sentiments that left me puzzled. I've encountered people who don't understand why people do computation outside of the database.
Uh,
So,
yeah. So you bring those prejudices to, well, this was a CTO. He just kept browbeating me. He told me, I don't have a computer science background. I'm a self-taught engineer. He said, you don't know about and he didn't ask me about it, but then he just sort of said, you don't know anything about NP completeness. and then and then he's like, oh, you're interested in philosophy? I've read philosophy. And then ultimately it was just a lot of like working me over and trying to break me down so that he could get to his real point, which was, we want to hire you, but you're asking for too much money. So if we kind of make you feel like you don't know what you're doing, we can try to get you for less money. That was ultimately what he wanted to do.
interesting.
And so then it ended up with, do you want to work here? And in my head was like, wow, this is scary. This guy is like mentally abusing me to try to get me to do what he wants. That doesn't sound like a kind of work environment I want. Thanks.
So I shouldn't use that tactic in future interviews.
I mean, you can if you want. Maybe if you want people who are amenable to being emotionally abused, I don't think you will. I know you. I really don't think you want to hire people that way, though. Like I know you have a good heart. I can see it.
Is it worth noting that our industry is a little bit odd in the sense that we do ask these sort of puzzle questions?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you can't talk about interviewing software engineers without talking about whiteboarding, algorithmic screenings. I think it is worth noting. What do you think about that?
So my experience over the years has been that I think one thing that's odd about our industry is that people don't always go to university to get a degree in software engineering. So you may be, I am a case of that, you're a case of that. So very often you may be interviewing people who have work experience, but they don't have, they don't have the engineering degree that sort of testifies that they have done these things in an academic environment.
Yeah, like me. If somebody listening to this interviews me, I don't have a computer science degree.
Yeah, and to be fair, I've also interviewed people with advanced degrees in computer science who couldn't really program in a practical way.
Hmm.
But so I think my experience over the years has been that you kind of do need to do something to determine that the person has the experience and the capabilities that they say.
What is
And
the something? Are you anticipating that question? You got to do something. I agree with that. I can't just hire people off. I want to know that they can do the job. I agree with you.
there's, there's this sort of cliche problem now in the field they call fizz buzz.
Hmm.
Fizz buzz is a programming problem that you give to people that, if you have any programming experience at all, should be trivial for you to solve.
Yes, I agree with that. It is trivial easy. Yeah, we could do that in our sleep, I think.
Right. And so if the person that you are interviewing has out and out lied about what they have done professionally or what they have done in school, then it's a pretty good detector. If they can't do that problem, they are probably, if they can't do that problem and they have represented themselves as being a competent programmer, then they are probably being dishonest with you.
Yeah, I mean, some people would say that's a low bar. Like, if you can't do this thing that
Yeah.
everybody can do, that's a pretty low. There's a pretty wide gulf between fizz buzz, trivial easy problem, and some of the other. I mean, I've been asked a number of times to implement least recently used cache, right? How many times have we accessed this item and we
Yeah.
want to like limit? I've been asked that probably three, four, or five times in different interviews. I've been asked trivial, like, loop through these files and find things. And there's a open a file and some that's easy. That's a FizzBuzz thing. One time I got asked a knapsack problem, which I couldn't do on the spot. That's a hard problem. There's like a wide spectrum, right?
Yeah. I was asked one time to implement a controller for an elevator,
That's like a
which is
distributed systems problem.
it's an interesting problem. I actually kind of like the problem, but it was funny because one of the interviewers gave me the problem and said, "I don't really know how to do this, but we're going to see how it goes." So that was an interesting experience.
I think in that last comment from your interviewer is telling to me because so when somebody asks me an algorithmic question in an interview, I want to know, is this representative of the work I'm doing? And, if you come to me and you give me a pretty hard problem, I'm probably going to be doing research on that problem. I'm probably going to look at other implementations. I'm probably going to look at examples. I don't want to do it wrong. I want to make sure I have the right thing. Should I study these algorithms that I don't use on a day to day basis? In some cases, I've never used or haven't used in many, many years, so that I can pass an interview where I won't be using those daily. And sometimes when I think that interviewers are giving these types of problems to candidates, it represents maybe two things. Maybe one is a fear. I don't want to make a mistake and hire someone who can't code. And the other might be like a kind of hazing. I went through this. Everybody has to go through it. And I know we're not talking about, I don't think we're talking about like a company like Google, which they probably get tens of thousands of applicants for every job. We're not talking about them. They need some advanced filtering. They're fine with throwing away huge numbers. You got to pass their bar. That's fine. We're talking about small and medium sized companies which have adopted these same practices, I think.
Yeah, and I think there's a tendency of the interviewers in certain cases to ask questions about things that they know really well,
Oh, yeah.
even though it's not something that you would typically do in the job or that you would typically do in any computer science role or
Hmm.
programming role. One of the companies that I worked for had this sort of standard problem that we would ask everyone. And at the time, I really liked it because it was a problem that I think any programmer could solve in sort of a brute force way. In fact, I think anybody with, you know, even somebody who wasn't a professional programmer could probably devise an algorithm to solve it. And then there were more sophisticated ways to do it. This is actually a famous problem that's in one of those programming pearls books.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it turns out to be surprising that there's an order n solution for this particular problem. The solution that most people come up with off the top of their heads is uh,
What can you give us a problem? Can you tell us a problem?
sure, yeah, it's you have a series of integers, and the goal is to find the subset of that series with the largest sum. And most people, there's some people just go deer in the headlights, even if they're totally competent programmers. And I I always hated that because you could tell people knew what they were doing and they would just sort of freeze.
Hmm.
But the experience that I typically had giving that problem in interviews was that people would come up with a order in cubed solution, and some people would come up with an order in squared solution.
Can we maybe just talk this out really quickly? So it's like a naive, greedy algorithm would be start at the first element in a list and figure out adding it with all of its sort of siblings stretching out, right? And then you
Yeah,
go to the next item in the list and you add it with all of its siblings. And the whole time you just sort of keep track of what your max sum is. That'd be the greedy, kind of not quite naive. Naive's not the right term, but that'd be like the straight ahead. It's slow, but it'll probably solve the problem solution,
yeah. I mean, the thing that most people come up with is you could just compute all possible sums. You
right?
know,
It's like a
assuming that the
permutations and then sum them all.
right. And although I remember when I did this problem as the applicant at this company, they had given me the problem statement, and I said, "Well, clearly, it's positive and negative integers. Otherwise, it would be you could just pretty much just sum across the whole thing." And the interviewer said, "Not as obvious as you would think." So apparently, that's something that people had gotten caught up on. But at the time, I thought it was a pretty good gatekeeping problem because it's just tricky enough that it's hard to do when you're nervous, but it's not
Hmm.
impossible.
I'm getting so I use the word permutations. I think that was wrong because it's only like in like a series of neighboring numbers, right? That's what we're looking at.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So, but I'm getting a hint from the way you're describing this that at some point you stopped believing in this problem.
yeah. Two things I think are wrong with it. One is that, well, I did have the experience that a couple of people did well on this problem and then turned out to be just not great fit for the jobs that they were hired for.
So those are false positives. You got a positive, but it was a bad positive.
Yeah, um, which surprised me, to be perfectly honest. I for a long time, we used this problem for 50 people, and it seemed to be almost foolproof.
Hmm.
But the other thing that I sort of came to realize is that a part of the reason why we asked this question, which was a little bit harder than trivial, is that we wanted to see how people would respond if they had to solve a problem on a timeline.
Hmm.
You we see this all the time where something breaks and you have to find a fix for that thing right now because it's business critical and you don't really have a lot of time to analyze it.
Yeah. Yeah. There's some pressure there. Solve it right now,
Right.
as soon as possible. We're losing money.
Yeah, and so we ask that, but um, I think it's a different type of pressure. So
It
I
is.
remember I remember at the time thinking there were several people we had interviewed who seemed like they had experience and should have been able to do this problem, and they struggled with it. And so I thought maybe this problem is harder than I think it is. So I asked my wife at the time, that how would you go about this? And I asked her in the car, and in the car, just sort of using hand gestures, she figured out a perfectly valid algorithm for solving the problem.
You gave me this problem many years ago when we first started working together, and I didn't solve it for like a day. And I was a little embarrassed. Like, wow, it took me like, I don't know. I thought about an answer. I thought, well, there's greedy, but there's got to be a better way to do it. And then I came back the next day. Like the morning I woke up and I was like, oh, I know how to solve that one. Took me like 24 hours. So I would have failed your interview.
Yeah, I sort of came to the conclusion that the sort of pressure that you're under in an interview with people looking at you and people having expectations is considerably different than the sort of pressure you're under when the system's broken and you need to get it fixed.
Yeah.
And I don't know the psychology of it, but I sort of have come to believe that beyond the super trivial problems, or some companies also do take home tests, which are presumably a little bit easier because you're not time constrained and you're not being observed.
Hmm.
Maybe that's okay. Um, But
There are whole groups of people who study these algorithmic code screenings so that they can pass the interviews. Right, these are lucrative fields. You can make a ton of money if you go and work, especially for large companies. Um, the fact that you could study this and practice it unnerves me a little bit. But maybe I'm just sensitive because I don't study this stuff. I probably would not pass one of these screenings myself. So that's probably my problem with it. Um, similarly, you had an example of people who passed the screening and then they were not contributing the way you thought. Uh, I imagine that'd probably be pretty surprising.
yeah, and I think, in our field especially, there are people who do really, really well on these sort of competition problems. So you give them pretty hard programming puzzles to solve, and they will crank out solutions. And
Hmm.
but they turn out to be relatively unproductive in a group setting because a lot of what goes on in developing software is working with the team.
Yeah.
And if you can't collaborate with the other people working on the team, or if you're you know abrasive, that may be that may cancel out all of your skills at programming.
So that's similar to the communicate. Like I think communication skills are. I know it's almost just it's sort of lame to say, but I think they're really important. Um, my preferred thing is to actually ask people about their work experience, ask them about things they've built. I'm pretty enthusiastic about building things, and I can often get a feel for whether or not people have really built the things they say they have. And one of the ways I achieve that is when people start describing what they've built, you try to get a picture in your head. And if you can't really get that picture assembled, they're either really bad at describing it or they really didn't do it. And if they're bad at describing it, you got to wonder, do I want to work with that person who can't describe what it is they want to build or what they have built? So there's a little bit of like a communication barrier there. Um, Sometimes though, if I don't ask people an algorithmic screening, like some code question, trivial or not, I have had people say, "How do you know I can write any code?" Or they imply like you're not very serious about interviewing people. Like you guys must be lame and terrible and have really poor software engineering at your organization if you don't even ask algorithmic screening questions. But here's my problem. Every time I've interviewed somebody and not done an algorithmic screening, I've just asked them about experience, and I have had this intense feeling in my gut that I really want to hire that person. My problem is I haven't been wrong yet. So I've cultivated this massive amount of hubris. So I'm just completely waiting to be knocked off my horse, and completely wrong. I have had people say, "Why don't you do these algorithmic screenings? You can't tell if I can write code." And I usually say, "Well, I haven't been wrong yet. I'm sure it will be at some point, and then I'll have to revise it, but I sort of got lucky so far." And part of my thing is I'm only going to say yes if I really, really, really feel it. Um, I really feel like I can get a sense for if people have done the work just by asking them. Is that unreasonable? Is that naive? Am I gonna get? We're talking. I've been interviewing people for 8 years.
I think it depends on the situation. Um, One of the first places that I worked, the first place that I worked professionally, was one of the supercomputer centers. And that is still the hardest interview I've ever had to do.
Hmm.
I was asked to give a presentation on some work I had done as an undergraduate, and I walked into this room and talked about that project to a group of people I didn't know
Hmm.
for close to an hour.
Hmm.
And I found out later that several people in the room were PhDs. There was one person in the room who had gotten his PhD when he was 21 years old from Caltech. Um, and, he was asking me questions. I had no idea who he was. Um, I did okay in that interview. I got that job, I think, because, I was talking about something that I worked a lot on. I had fairly deep knowledge of.
Hmm.
Um, but in that same organization, we had, I remember being in an interview for somebody who had worked at I think either Scripps Institution of Oceanography or Southwest Fisheries or one of those places, and they had a master's degree in computer science.
Mm.
And they had worked on this very interesting project, and they described the project, and we were enthusiastic about this person because they'd done really interesting work. And then when they came into the organization to do practical day-to-day work, it turned out that they just really had no practical programming experience, and were doing things like you know copy and pasting code to do
Oh,
slight variations in computation. So it was, I think it's possible to fail even when you are giving somebody a lot of latitude to talk about a project that they're interested in.
there's two thoughts that occur to me there. One, the coworkers I value the most in software engineering roles are those who understand the limits of their knowledge and are always embracing that. Okay, I got to learn, I got to know more. Not like I'm going to force myself to constantly be learning, but they're upfront about what they don't know. This is sort of intellectual honesty. I value that really highly. So if I'm in an interview setting, which is stressful, and I dig into somebody's experience and I can push it beyond where they went. I go deeper than they went. And if they're going to say in the interview, I don't really know. That to me is that's huge points because if you could say like we're honest with each other, if we could say this is what we don't know, then we know what we can go out and figure out. The other thing that occurs to me as you're speaking is going back to the fear. If I give these algorithmic screenings, I'm less likely to make a mistake. That's the false positive. I kind of feel like if I made a mistake, we would get rid of that person. Maybe this is harsh, but we could fire people. We can hire them for 30 days. If it doesn't work out, if the performance is not there, we can get rid of them. Is there too much of a fear of the negative repercussions, maybe of false positives? I keep thinking about this as like a confusion matrix: true positive, true negative, false positive, false negative. Is there too much fear about the false positives?
I think it depends on the company. If you're in a small company, letting somebody go might not be that big of a deal, but they're in larger companies that are subject to have compliance departments and HR departments. It may be necessary to put somebody on a performance improvement program, or document the fact that they are not performing up to expectations, and it may
Hmm.
take time and it may take money. So I think there's a little bit of a people are a little bit gun shy about hiring people who might not work out,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it may take longer to get them out of the company than it took to get them in.
I
um,
have a different direction I want to go in, but first, before we move on, I want to kind of get a like a I don't know, a 1 to 10 algorithmic screening, yay or nay? Are you neutral? 5, definitely have to include it. 8, you probably don't need it. 3, never. 1, where would you put yourself?
are you talking about algorithms that look at resumes and
No, I'm talking about when you interview people, giving them coding puzzles, algorithmic problems. Do you need to include that in your interview process when you interview people for software engineering roles?
at this point I would say no. I am on the fence about people who are entry level.
Hmm.
So I think there might be some benefit in giving somebody who's entry level, uh, like a FizzBuzz type problem.
Hmm.
But in general, I just don't think it correlates that well.
Hmm. It's
I
not
think,
predictive.
yeah, and I think the things that we value, we meaning you and I, are probably more cultural things and human things than they are technical things. Obviously, we want people to be technically skilled, but I think being able to communicate with people and having sort of a similar taste about things is probably more important
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
than your ability to perform.
I guess I want to believe that people who are fluent in things should be able to speak about them with some fluency. And so there's that communication thing. Now, I was curious, I'm not sure if you did any looking into this yourself, but what do they do in other industries? Is software engineering, in so many other cases where we imagine we are special, unique snowflakes, we do things totally differently than the rest of the world. We call ourselves engineers. We don't have any tests or certifications for that. We interview in this funny way. But, there are other fields where it's hard to figure out. There's creative problem solving involved. I want to hire someone who can do the job. How do I find that person? I was thinking, among my social circle, I know people who've worked in law. And so I imagine hiring an attorney is hard, very intellectual work. I know people who work in biotech here in San Diego, and they're hiring scientists. And I have friends who are teachers. And I thought, wow, teaching, that'd be a hard job to hire for. So I asked friends of mine this question. Have you hired experts before? How do you determine their expertise? I didn't ask them about creative problem solving, a little bit, maybe a problem of mine. One other person I asked has been involved in hiring scientists at associate director and above, he said, for a long time for a biotech firm. And he said what you said about your supercomputer center work. He said they invite scientists in, they give a presentation, a panel of scientists or a group of scientists will ask them questions about their work. They talk about their past work experience to see if they're a good fit. He said there are some like baseline things for scientists. They have assays that they need to know about, and I'm just repeating the word assays. I think that means some kind of test of something. You probably know what that means. I don't know what that means, but what he described was like, I was like, wow, you're hiring scientists, and that's what you're doing. I want to hire people similarly to that. I want to do that. If it works for you, I imagine it can work for me. And I said to him, well, what if they don't work out? And the person I asked was general counsel for a biotech firm. So he's like head of all legal. HR reports to him. He's involved in hiring these for lofty titles. He said, you can let them go if they don't work out. People are sometimes too afraid of firing people who don't work out. I was surprised he said that because I thought somebody with a legal mind would be like, yeah, you got to 3 months and performance. And so if it works for scientists, I imagine it could work for us. What do you think? What do they do in other industries? What other industries where is it hard to hire people to solve problems like what we're doing?
I think people worry about in the software engineering field. I think people worry about people talking about their prior work because there may be things in there that are proprietary or
Mm,
sensitive in other ways. And so people don't want to get into the whole intellectual property thing.
mm,
I,
mm,
I think in other fields, like I don't know what goes on when you hire a lawyer or when you hire a doctor, but I think in those professions, they are they benefit from the fact that they have sort of a track record.
mm.
So, if you're a litigator, you've probably tried cases, you've probably
Right.
got a
That's all
record of,
public. Your public
right.
case history is all public. Yeah.
Yeah, and doctors as well. If you're a GP, you probably have Yelp reviews. So it's
But you might not want those as part of your interview.
yeah. So I imagine that probably when you are a lawyer, they don't ask you questions about you know contract law that you learned in law school. I don't know,
Mm,
but I
mhm,
I assume they don't. Um, I did ask. My wife works in the field of clinical trials. Is she's involved in the side of clinical trials that has to do with manufacturing and packaging and shipping drug product to the trial sites and stuff like that.
mhm, mhm.
And I asked her about what she does in interviews because it's a fairly technical field. Most people have backgrounds in some biochemistry, molecular biology, that kind of thing.
That's similar to the biotech person I asked.
Yeah. So she said she doesn't ask like puzzle questions, but she might ask a question like, "We're about to set up a trial for a new experimental drug. What steps do you take to do that?"
Mhm, mhm.
And I kind of like that. In fact, I think that might actually apply to our field as well. You could ask somebody who's got a couple of years experience at least. Suppose you're going to start a new web service project. What would the steps be that you would take to get that underway? I think that
Yeah, that's a good question. I like that question. Yeah.
I, but yeah, I I got to believe that this whole thing about asking puzzle questions is probably unique to our field. I would assume even in other engineering fields, they rely more on your credentials and
Mm.
your work experience than on asking you to solve problems from, giving you homework problems essentially.
Biotech person I talked to said, "Well, I put a lot of weight on previous experience. Sometimes people you get a weird vibe when they start talking about their experience." I said, "Oh, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, some people are really good at leaving jobs just before they get fired, and you have to kind of read between the lines when they're talking about that experience to see that that might have happened." He said he tries to talk really a lot to references, even to the current or former boss, even though people often don't want them to want you to talk to their boss. He says references hold a lot of weight. And I think that's true in any industry. If you have someone who can vouch for someone else and you trust the voucher, they're less self-interested in the process. I'll give you a different one that I thought was interesting. I talked to a friend of mine who's a teacher. She has sat on interview panels for teaching here in San Diego in the school district. And she this is a process she told me that they had to use. They had 8 questions. The questions were given to the candidates beforehand. Candidates would come in with their notes on the questions. The people interviewing on the panel could not ask follow up or supplemental questions. That was it.
Hmm.
8 questions. And I was like, well, that sounds like a lot of pressure. There's a lot riding on that. She said, you have no idea because if we hire these people, they also get tenure after 2 years. So we got 8 questions to figure out is this somebody we want to potentially hire for life? Like, that's a little bit harder than what we're doing. And I was like, have you considered algorithmic screening questions? That might help you.
Yeah, never really thought about that. I guess that's probably true on all levels of teaching, that you really want to get that decision right. Although I guess in university setting you can deny people tenure, but yeah, that's tricky.
There's Mark Grant, who is a color commentator for Padres baseball. He's been doing it for 25 years. He's great. He has this phrase, look away, adjust in. This is Major League Baseball batters. What they're doing is they're looking for soft away pitches, and then if one happens to come inside, they can adjust. So I'm going to give you a sweet baseball analogy here. Interviewing people could be like that. Like you're looking for some profile, some set of skills or whatever, but you get something different than what you're expecting, and you think, oh, this I can work with this. This is a fastball inside. I really want that. Thinking about that, I was thinking about job listings. Often you look at job listings and it's kind of like you have to read through the lines like, what do they really want here? And I don't know about you, if you've looked at any listings lately. When I look at job listings, I feel like they're less specific than they used to be. Here's an example. There was some job, I think it was a senior software engineering job. Um, and they say we want in-depth experience of Java, C Sharp, Python, JavaScript, and related frameworks. Okay, you want all that or one of those? And what are you using? Like, is it fair to tell me what you're actually building in on it? Because if I hang out with a bunch of this may sound pejorative. I don't mean it pejorative, but if I hang out with a bunch of Java developers, that's a different group of people than a bunch of Python developers and a bunch of JavaScript developers. Like the tools they're reaching for, the databases they're using, the way they're deploying, these things are going to be different. And I kind of want to know before I consider coming to work in your environment. Just a mental picture would help me a little bit. That same listing, they also said we want proven knowledge of software development best practices. One bullet. Proven knowledge of software development best practices, design architecture, database, PostgreSQL, MS SQL Server, API, Lambda, microservice, cloud technologies, AWS, Azure, containerization, Docker, Kubernetes, and usage at scale. It's like, what? What are you doing? Can you just tell me what you're doing? I'm not going to lie to you. If I haven't done that, I won't apply.
Yeah, I wonder about some of these job ads as well. I mean, we have also gone through the process of creating these ads, and there's a little bit of an art to it. But
Oh, yeah.
I do notice the same thing where, I've seen job ads where they say you should know an object oriented language like Java, C Sharp, or Python.
Yeah, right.
And
Because I've seen that too. I'm like, are you saying we're going to be doing gang of four patterns in Python? Is that what you're telling me?
yeah, I always get this sort of one of these things is not like the other feeling on those. But
Yeah. Sesame Street. Good call out there. I like that one.
yeah, I just figure I think when we build these job ads, we tend to tailor them to what we do and what the responsibilities of the job are. And I don't feel like I don't feel like everyone is doing that. I don't understand why. I guess maybe they're hedging their bets, or maybe they have such a mix of technologies that they really are looking for people who have one of those things.
Yeah, and maybe there's different teams. Like you come in, you interview, and then we'll figure out what team you're on. Job listings that excite me are are listings where I'm like, oh, I might be able to do that, but there's a little bit of risk there, like a little bit of risk. I want to be good at it. I want to know I can do it, but I want there to be a little bit of risk. If you give me a job listing and it's like I've done all those things and I've done them for many years, I'm probably not that interested. I want listings where I could be better at, get better at things and be around people who know more than I do. The look away, adjust in thing. The example of that for me is we hired someone at my job probably 8 months ago, and this person on paper, PHP developer. Now we don't have any PHP. We have no plans to deploy anything in PHP. This person came in, interviewed. We really liked this person, and you know what? He's worked out. He's been great. He's contributed in Python. He started contributing in some of our Rust services. He's become a huge fan of Rust. He's starting to build Rust on his own time on the weekend. And if you just sort of looked at him and said, here's somebody who's got PHP experience, no, then we wouldn't have been receptive to his capabilities. This is a great programmer, great to have on a team. And sometimes I wonder if these job listings are like this really wide net. Like you show up with these skills and you can solve problems with code. Great. We don't care what language. You can use ours. That's fine. I still want to know what language you're using. I don't want to write some languages. I don't hate them. I've never met a language I hated. I just don't want to write them every day, please. So I want to know what you're using. Please tell me that.
Agreed. Yeah.
I want to tell you about the worst job interview experience I've ever read about. This pales in comparison to anything that ever happened to me. My CTO, who was browbeating me and trying to make me feel bad about myself so he could pay me less, this is not even in the same ballpark. I read about this many, many years ago. I think it's pretty famous. It was on Reddit. I'm going to read it to you. It's not that long, so I'm going to read it to you. So the person writes, using a throwaway account here, I just need to get this off my chest because I currently feel like Hitler. I haven't told anyone this in real life yet because part of me is still hoping I'm asleep, and this is a nightmare. I interviewed with a small startup in the city this morning. I don't know what city. Phone screening went incredibly well, and I was feeling good about this place. They don't have a dedicated room for interviews, and the place was small enough that all the engineers were just taking part of it. We were at the whiteboard, so here's whiteboarding again, and I was drawing a diagram for a system design question. I didn't know they had an office dog. I didn't know the office dog was about 18 and the founder's best friend since childhood. I didn't know the little guy. I'm talking super little, like squirrel small, likes to hang out around people's feet. I took a step back from the board to look at something better and stepped on her. I don't mean stepped on her foot or something. I mean right on her, proper. She gave out a heart shattering yelp and died after squirming a little bit. I still can't fathom that this actually happened. The founder started to sob uncontrollably, and I think everyone else was in just as great disbelief. This is the last paragraph. I don't know how to try and make something like that right. I don't think I can handle working there, even if they still did want me. I just kind of apologized profusely and left. How do you make up for something like that?
Yeah, I think that wins.
Yeah.
It's hard to even envision something worse than that happening in a job interview. I don't know.
I don't know that was possible.
It reminds me a little of this news story I saw last night where there was this woman who was out mowing her lawn and a snake fell out of the sky and started to tangle itself around her arm, which is pretty weird in and of itself. But soon after the snake started to attack her, a hawk flew out of the sky and started to attack the snake.
It was mad she got its dinner.
Yeah, I think that's the theory, is that the hawk probably dropped the snake and was trying to retrieve it. But in any case, just highly unlikely scenario that is. It didn't happen during a job interview though, so I guess that's okay.
Okay, so to sum up, here's what I want to know from you. If I just keep asking people questions about their experience and trying to go deeper and deeper and deeper, and I keep naively, stupidly, arrogantly believing that I can know the answer, am I going to get bitten by this someday, or am I going to continue to bat 1,000?
You will get bitten by it someday, but I think you will probably continue to have a pretty high average.
Okay, I'm batting for average then. That's all we can ask for, right? Batting for average. As an interviewer, what do you think? What was your career average? Wins, losses? Maybe not wins, average. I'm mixing metaphors now. How many touchdowns did you score in that at bat, Mike?
um, I would say that I'm probably hired more people who worked out well than people who didn't, but my average is definitely not 1,000. I couldn't put a number to it, but I can pretty easily think back on people that I hired who did not work out. So
But
it's
those are probably like it's easier to recall like bad memories than good ones. It sounds like you're saying the majority were good. Can you give us a rough estimate of the sample size we're talking about? How many interviews would you guess you've conducted in your career? And how many people do you think you've actually said, yes, I want to hire this person in your career? Can you kind of give us a rough estimate?
that's tough. I would say I've probably done somewhere around 200, 250 interviews. Probably hired somewhere around 40 or 50 people.
Hmm. I would have guessed more than that. 250. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, some jobs I've had jobs in the past, or I've been interviewing for jobs in the past that where we went through 10 or 12 applicants. So, but yeah, I would say probably 70% of them have been wins, and the other 30% have been various degrees of failures.
That's a good average. You know what, though, Mike? Not as good as mine.
No, I don't think I will ever catch up with you.
Wow. Okay. I'll take it. So this is Picture Me Coding. I'm your host, Eric Aker, with my co host, Mike Mull. See you later.
See you next time.
Bye bye.